Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, we would like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple applications which you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the Maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. Additional material, including a copy of today's slide deck, is available in the Resource List widget, indicated by the green file icon on the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your questions. You can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. There's a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command-R on Mac to refresh your player console. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast using the same audience link to join today's event. Now I'd like to introduce Gina Livermore. Gina, you have the floor.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for attending today's forum. My name is Gina Livermore. I'm the Director of Mathematica Center for Studying Disability Policy. Today's webinar is in honor of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This historic law seeks to ensure that people with disabilities have the same opportunities to participate in aspects of American life as everyone else. Over the past 30 years, there's been significant progress towards the inclusion of people with disabilities, but we still have a ways to go before the ADA's goals of inclusion and equal opportunity are fully realized. For today's forum, we're excited to welcome a panel of distinguished speakers who will offer their perspectives on where we are now and where we're headed 30 years after the ADA. Joining us today is John Sheeta, Acting Executive Director of the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. John has spent more than 2 decades advancing policies and services for people with disabilities, and in past lives he served as Director of the National Institute of Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, and held leadership positions with healthcare and rehabilitation service providers, where he developed models and policies to improve the outcomes of people with disabilities. Also with us today is Jennifer Sheehy, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Disability Employment Policy in the Department of Labor. Jennifer's had a variety of leadership roles in federal agencies responsible for disability policy and programs, including 10 years at the Department of Education, in agencies overseeing disability services and research. Before joining the federal government, Jennifer was Vice President of the National Organization on Disability. We're also pleased to have with us Jill Houghton, President and CEO of Disability In, a nonprofit that helps businesses achieve disability inclusion and equality. For the past 25 years, Jill has worked in different capacities to advance the inclusion of people with disabilities. Before Disability In, she was the Executive Director of the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Advisory Panel, and her expertise is sought by large corporations and the federal government, including testifying before Congress on issues related to recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees with disabilities. Finally, we welcome Jason Fichtner, Associate Director of the International Economics and Finance Program at Johns Hopkins. Jason's research focuses on Social Security and federal tax and budget policy. He's developed proposals to reform the Social Security Disability Insurance Program in ways intended to better support employment. And like the others on our panel, Jason has a history of working for the federal government, including positions at the Social Security Administration. So before I turn it over to our speakers, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at a few indicators of where we are now. So with respect to prevalence of disability, currently about 13% or 43 million Americans of all ages has a disability. This is probably an undercount because the measure these numbers are based on doesn't capture certain types of disabilities very well, like mental health conditions and intellectual disabilities. Other estimates put the prevalence of disability as high as 27%. This graphic shows prevalence increasing slightly over the past decade, but for reasons I won't go into, it's unclear whether it's increased significantly over time. But given that life expectancy has gone up and population of baby boomers are now over age 55, it's likely there have been real increases in prevalence over the past few decades. So An important provision of the ADA is that it requires services to be delivered to people with disabilities in the most integrated settings appropriate, including in the community rather than in institutions. Currently, about 3.5% of people with disabilities under age 65 live in institutions. The rates shown on this slide include residents of correctional facilities as well as nursing homes, but nonetheless, they suggest there's been a decline in institutionalization of about 10% over the past decade. And I suspect that if I'd been able to find statistics that included the over 65 population, the downward trend might be a little more pronounced than what you see here. So in terms of education, people with disabilities are less educated than their peers without disabilities. 20% have less than a high school level of education, a rate that's twice the rate for people without disabilities. And people with disabilities are also half as likely to have a college degree or higher. The ADA includes provisions that prohibit employers from discriminating based on disability in hiring, promoting, and retaining workers, and requires employers to make reasonable accommodation. However, there's still a significant gap between the employment rates of people with and without disabilities. The employment rate of people with disabilities at around 38% is half that of people without disabilities. And these are annual employment rates shown here, not the current employment rates going on during the pandemic. The employment rate for people with disabilities was just starting to get back up to where it was before the 2008 recession, when the pandemic started. History has shown that the employment rate of people with disabilities takes a relatively bigger hit during economic downturns compared to those without disabilities, and that unfortunately is likely to be the case again with what we are experiencing now. With respect to earnings, even among those who work full-time and full year, average earnings are about 13% lower for workers with disabilities. And this in part is likely due to the lower levels of education I showed earlier, resulting in more having low skill or lower wage jobs than workers without disabilities. So the low employment rates, the relatively lower earnings, these things contribute to a poverty rate among working age people with disabilities that's more than twice that of their peers without disabilities. The 27% poverty rate you see on this slide for people with disabilities is really quite astounding. If I had to pick a statistic to sum it all up, this might be one. It says, to me anyway, that there's still a lot to do to eliminate disparities between people with and without disabilities. So given the high rates of poverty among people with disabilities, many, or I should say most, participate in public assistance programs. One study estimated that 2/3 of working age people with disabilities participate in at least one safety net program. And this slide shows that in 2014, the latest year for which I could find information, it's my information, but haven't done it since. So 2014, the federal government spent $500 billion on on programs for working age people with disabilities or ones that they might participate in at high rates. And nearly all of this was for health care and income assistance, primarily through Medicare, Medicaid, and the federal disability programs. So I will stop talking now and turn to our panel to get their thoughts on where we are heading 30 years after the ADA. Later, we'll be taking audience questions, as Brian mentioned, so please submit them at any time using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So let's start with John. John, your career is focused on health, community integration, and independent living of people with disabilities. And in recent years, the availability of supports that help people with disabilities live in the community and the role of Medicaid in financing those supports have been important policy considerations. Also important is defining what community integration really means for people with disabilities and considering the types of supports that people might need. So can you talk a bit about what you think the key challenges are in this realm and what kinds of research and policies could help address the challenges going forward?
Thanks, Gina. Hard to talk about the ADA and community integration without talking about the Supreme Court's Olmstead decision, which also recently had an anniversary. We all know the language, least restrictive setting, because of that ruling, which was a major victory in the effort to get people with disabilities out of institutions and into community-based settings. The ruling also talks about the language you used in your introduction, the most integrated setting, being one that enables individuals with disabilities to interact with non-disabled persons to the fullest extent possible. And it was Title II of the ADA that the justices cited in Olmstead, which prohibits disability-based discrimination by state and local governments. So the ADA provides a right to live in a community. Unfortunately, it doesn't include the services necessary to make that right a reality. That's where Medicaid comes in all its imperfect glory. So one fundamental challenge, Medicaid and the Americans with Disabilities Act are not in sync. There's a disconnect. We continue to have an institutional bias in the Medicaid program. Everyone has a right to skilled nursing facility care or to live in a more restrictive licensed setting, but not necessarily a right to the waivers that provide access to home and community-based services. So we have the ADA with its aspirations of inclusion. We have Olmstead, which is great progress. Courts use the ADA to realize that aspiration of inclusion. But Olmstead and other subsequent decisions have also allowed states to take into account the resources available to the public entity, which is also another challenge. As a result, we have hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities that are on state waiting lists for home and community-based services, and many individuals that are still trapped in institutions. So don't get me wrong, we've made tremendous progress, but we still have this fundamental challenge within the Medicaid program. Other challenges, and you mentioned COVID in your introductory remarks, even before COVID, one of the largest line items in state budgets, there are two, K-12 education and health and human services spending, which is made up mostly by Medicaid expenditures. So states are strapped and have been strapped, and even more so now with COVID. We're seeing higher unemployment rates. We're seeing increases in the Medicaid rolls as a result of people losing their employer-based insurance, lower tax revenue across the board, property tax, income tax, sales tax collections are all down, and an increased demand in home and community-based services as a result of demographics as well. So these are some fundamental challenges that we're all facing now. And what can we do about it? A couple of things. The first is to reinforce the importance of home and community-based services and their contribution to overall health and medical stability. Home and community-based services, by definition, are not medical in nature. They are not skilled services that are being provided by medical professionals. In many cases, they focus on addressing social determinants of health, like nutrition and employment. And we know from the literature what a profound impact these social determinants have on a person's overall well-being. Second, I think we need to recalibrate our Medicaid waivers themselves toward more of a targeted set of services based on need and away from many of the diagnostic approaches that we've historically taken that provide access to a broad array of services. States like Tennessee are doing some very creative things that have gotten a lot of attention. The goal here would be to deliver a more targeted set of services to a larger population and begin to decrease the size of those waiting lists at the state level that we're seeing for these critical home and community services. Third, on the provider side, we need financial incentives for existing providers to innovate and new providers to enter the market. How can we more quickly move toward payment based on outcomes achieved and not services delivered? This need is especially acute in the area of mental health services. The community infrastructure in many, many places doesn't come close to matching the community need. Fourth, we've seen the medical service world develop advanced data measurement systems and build bundled payments and other value-based purchasing arrangements using them. But we still struggle on the community-based side of the continuum to measure the positive impact of these critical home and community-based services. Progress has been made, and the framework that was created through the National Quality Forum a few years ago was a huge step forward, but we need to build on that. This is one area where critical research dollars need to be invested, and more research dollars need to be invested. When I was the director of NIDLR, we started a research and training center focused on home and community-based service outcomes. That will be recompeted this year, which is great to see. And yes, CMS has also spent considerable sums in this area, but until we can defend the value proposition for home and community-based services, we're going to continue to lose the battle within state capitals, especially in tight budget times. We're seeing these rate cuts right now in states like New York, Michigan, Ohio, and I hear California is going to be next. Finally, an area of needed research, looking at Medicaid managed care programs. This is a trend that's increased over the last number of years, although it's stabilized over the last 18 months or so. We still have a majority of states that are integrating their Medicaid managed care programs to bring together both the medical services and the home and community-based services I've been talking about under one often capitated payment system. That's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. It creates an opportunity for tremendous flexibility. Health plans have that flexibility to deliver non-traditional services, things like assistive technology or even purchasing air conditioners for people with disabilities, for example. But are they using that flexibility, and how are states, more importantly, holding them accountable in their contracts with these managed care organizations to ensure positive outcomes for people with disabilities? So to summarize, we've made tremendous progress since the ADA was passed to increase access to home and community-based services. The trend line for spending on community-based services is increasing. That for institutional services is decreasing. Olmstead was a game changer that accelerated the shift away from institutional settings and toward home and community-based services, but we need to do a better job of giving more people access to those services, targeting them more finely based on need, and measuring their value to provide, or to prove rather, that they are worth paying for. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, John. I have a question for you. Could you elaborate a little bit on when you said recalibrate the Medicaid services, and you mentioned as an example, you think Tennessee has sort of done that. I think I heard that correctly, to target specific types of services to a population that's in need. And so I just, not having a lot of knowledge about this area, if you could elaborate a little bit on what that would look like in terms of the services and the populations.
Sure. So there are a lot of similarities with people, regardless of diagnosis, with complex neurological conditions, for example. So they have ADLs that they need assistance with. They have IADLs that they need assistance with, and in pretty predictable ways. And we can look at past expenditures for those populations. I think the general theme here is historically we've given access to discrete populations of individuals with a wide array of services available to them, which has left people on the outside on waiting lists for those waivers. So instead, if we can shrink the service menu, target them more finely towards services that are needed, not necessarily based on diagnosis, but functional ability and what people can do, and to then deliver those services in ways that, again, will bring access to more populations. And Tennessee, as one example, has done a great job of looking at their waiver options, looking at the different populations, and being able to cut those populations more finely to target services in ways that address immediate needs and shrink that service menu to give access to more people. Does that make sense?
Yep. I'm curious about what you think might be extraneous services, but I don't know. You may not have the knowledge to answer that, because that's pretty in-depth going into what a specific state might offer. But if you have some sense of that, I'd be interested to hear.
And let me be clear. I think I'm not advocating for cutting services out, but to be able, historically we've had a brain injury waiver. We've had a waiver for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities with broad service menus. So can we look at utilization within those service menus? Certainly continue to give people the services they need, but can we look at expenditures, utilization, and functional needs and abilities of people versus a simple diagnostic category in order to spread the dollars further and reduce those waiting lists? I'm making it sound incredibly simple. We know it's incredibly hard to do that, and the data is often...
It's not that hard. They can hire Mathematica, do data analytics for them. We'll figure it out. So. Right. All right. Well, thank you, John. I think I'm supposed to move on to Jennifer and into the realm of employment, which is a fundamental activity to ensuring the community integration of people with disabilities and critical to securing their economic and independence and well-being. Jennifer, as we saw on the slides, the employment rates of people with disabilities remain substantially below those of their peers without disabilities. Can you talk about the challenges to improving the employment of people with disabilities and some of the newest or the most important initiatives the Department of Labor is undertaking to address those challenges?
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you very much for including ODEP today. So the employment situation, employment for someone with a disability is complex. I mean, you heard John talk about it and some of the challenges that still exist. They're from a service program, policy, and certainly attitudinal perspective. All of those challenges still exist. ODEP, Office of Disability Employment Policy in the Department of Labor, was founded, actually wasn't that long ago, only about 20 years ago, because there were so many different systems, programs, and services and policies involved in successful, sustained employment for people with disabilities, that coordination element really was critical. So ODEP was founded to look at across all those systems and work with partners like the nonprofits or other federal agencies, Congress, and businesses, of course. And of course, you've got all of us today representing those different sectors, and policy researchers, a very critical element in that equation. So that is one important function that ODEP can serve, is bringing all those partners together to collaborate on making policy recommendations to improve outcomes. When you think of anybody's career trajectory, I think of a comedian, Mitch Hedberg, who said, "I'm sick of following my dreams. I just want them to tell me where they're going, and I will hook up with them later." It's because it's complicated for anyone. There are just so many decisions and factors that go into deciding what you want to do, figuring out what skills you need, training for those skills, getting a job, being successful in the job, and then advancing in that job. But for people with disabilities, it's really complicated. I'm going to talk about three different ways that I think we can work together to improve employment. One is data. 2 is early intervention. 3 is working on future policy issues. And 4 is working with states. And I think hopefully you will hear that these are good approaches by just some of the things that John and our other wonderful speakers say today. So data. ODEP, I wasn't there at the time, but ODEP worked with partners and the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Department of Labor to have employment statistics for people with disabilities as late as 2009. So prior to 2009, people with disabilities weren't included in those employment statistics that have become so important and so common that we report. So the data is necessary, but the aggregate data probably doesn't tell us enough about where we need to work, what's working and what isn't working. We do things like the Bureau of Labor Statistics just published a supplement on people with disabilities. And this was an update to a supplement that ODEP did with BLS back in 2019 or 2009. And so it gives you trend data for 10 years. It also breaks out federal contractors because there have been policy updates that really promote employment of people with disabilities with federal contractors in just a few years ago. So you can look at some of the things that have changed and perhaps get some idea of where to focus efforts. I'm sorry, that was 2012. And we really need to look at specific industries, geographic areas, ages, different disabilities in order to target those approaches. The second thing is early intervention. So we are doing something in return to work grants. It's our retained grants. And we have, this was based on research we did for 5 years with experts like Jason, who you will hear looking at all sorts of proposals to address why people go on to SSDI, and is there a point at which in that pathway early intervention might be, early intervention and coordinated services might help someone make the decision to go back to work and not need the SSDI benefits, because we know that once someone is on SSDI, they have that only less than 5% ever go off of SSDI to go back to work, and less than 1% in a year go back to work. So we are looking at a model that Washington State was using that was successful in reducing applications for SSDI by approximately 30%. So we're trying this in, we've got pilots in 8 states. They will soon compete for a phase 2 full implementation demonstration grant. And we hope that we will have success in those grants, and we will learn more that can be applicable to policies that affect many more states and perhaps the nation. So early intervention also means helping young people with disabilities get that first job, get the education and training they need. We have an apprenticeship inclusion model. We're going to look at what it takes for fully successful, accessible apprenticeships in the high demand industries to help young people with disabilities. And we are also running a SSI, what we call the SSI Solutions Initiative. And this is based on the SSDI Solutions Initiative that was very successful in the sense that it recruited, solicited so many wonderful proposals and really helped drive the discussion on SSDI reform. So our solutions, through our Solutions Initiative, we have 12 researchers and groups that we're working with. They will develop policy papers, we'll do a forum, We'll explore them and their viability for going forward as policy solutions. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about the policy development. Getting into the early stages is so critical for people with disabilities, and making sure that people with disabilities are not left behind. One example of that is technology. If we can make sure that features for accessibility are built into the beginning of new technology solutions, then technology can enable people with disabilities. In fact, level the playing field. If not, then they further divide people with disabilities from those without disabilities. We've been working with the Department of Transportation and many developers, auto manufacturers, and technology companies and advocacy groups to make sure that autonomous vehicle policy is inclusive. So as autonomous vehicles are designed and the rules about them are decided in the states, people with disabilities will be part of that early discussion, and I think that's critically important. Finally, working with states. So as you heard John talk about, states do have a lot of autonomy within working on policy that can affect people with disabilities in all areas, in the housing, transportation, employment, education, healthcare. And sometimes working with the states can have a faster benefit than trying to work through the very, very important process that results in national policy. So we have the State Exchange Employment and Disability. Through that, in the last year alone, we've worked with, we've been able to help states with achieving their goals on disability policy with 150 policy actions. So those are just some very, very quick snapshots of initiatives that we hope will help move that employment rate that you talked about, and look forward to working with partners on those. Thank you.
So it sounds like Department of Labor is involved in a wide variety of things, more than I was aware of. And I wanted to ask you about one of your initiatives, because it's one I've been curious about and have done a little bit of work around, and that's around helping states build their systems to be more consistent with the employment first principle. And for people who aren't aware of this, it's employment first is a framework that emphasizes that all people, including those with really significant disabilities, are able to participate in competitive integrated employment and community life. And the tension I've seen is service providers trying to provide the jobs, for folks, and then employers, not always meshing. And I think maybe with Jill, we'll get into that a little more. But I'm wondering if you're aware of some of the more significant challenges that states have had in trying to transform their systems. You talked about you've been helping states and you've gotten these policies through. Can you give a few examples and maybe what's been hard and what's been easy for states to do?
Sure. So, and many states have adopted employment first policies. I think actually all 50 states now have adopted some kind of employment first policy. And as you articulated, it's premised on the belief that people with any disability can work in the competitive labor market at above minimum wage. So but what's needed is so many state systems. And in our employment first work, we actually work with 6 state systems the Medicaid, mental health services, vocational rehabilitation in the workforce, education, and transportation in some cases. So getting all of these state agencies to work together sometimes takes policy realignment. It takes memorandums of understanding, data sharing. It takes understanding how you can cobble together the funding streams, call it braiding, so that someone with a disability can be supported in a veterinarian's office and not necessarily in sheltered workshops or in a center-based workshop. So that's not always easy. It's shifting a lot of different previous policies. Sorry about the helicopter. and making sure that everybody who is there really putting policies in place so that when people leave, the champions that believe in the employment first principles, that when they leave, the policies are in place to sustain the progress. So I would give you an example of like transportation. Working on accessible transportation, public transportation, 25 million people have reported that they have transportation limiting disabilities. 2/3 of communities don't necessarily have accessible public transportation. So that's a problem. If you are in a center-based job that might not be integrated, but you have transportation from your home, then you need to have policies and solutions so someone can use a public transportation system to get to work. So just making sure that states understand how to do that is something that we would do in our employment first work.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. I think staying on the topic of employment, I want to move to Jill to give us some insights on the employer perspective. And actually, I'm glad that was a helicopter, Jennifer, because it sounded something like something else. And I'm like, who's not on mute? But now, hopefully everyone's on mute except Jill. Jill, I'm sure you know better than most just how important employer attitudes and practices are in determining how easily job seekers with disabilities can find jobs and be successful in them. Your nonprofit, Disability In, works with companies to promote the inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace. Can you tell us a little about how Disability In works with employers and talk about some of the disability inclusion practices you see model employers using today?
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Gina. At Disability In, everything that we do is based on the needs of business. And so if I was going to paint a picture, I'd paint an intersection of where business and talent with disabilities intersect. That being said, about 7 years ago, we joined forces at Disability In with the American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD. And we did so to create a tool, to create something called the Disability Equality Index. We did that because business was saying to us, like, where do we get started? And rather than recreating the wheel, we reached out to the LGBTQ space, and we learned from the work of HRC and something that they have called the Corporate Equality Index. So together with AAPD, we formed an advisory committee that's comprised of people with disabilities, as well as business people who also happen to have disabilities that sit in a wide variety of places within corporate America, and created this tool called the Disability Equality Index. We call it the DEI. The DEI really helps business benchmark their disability inclusion practices, and it looks at things like culture and leadership, employment practices, enterprise-wide access, community engagement, supplier diversity, and non-U.S. operations. It has weighted questions and non-weighted questions. And there is, with every question, you have to substantiate your answers. So with the diversity of questions in the survey, it creates an opportunity for the Fortune 1000 scope companies, so big companies, and the American Law 200 firms to really go within their business, cross-functionally, look across the business, and ask questions about what they're doing. At the end of the day, they receive a score. Those that score an 80, a 90, or 100, we celebrate as a top place for disability inclusion. And those that score beneath an 80, we don't call out because it's a carrot and not a stick. I think it's really important to call out that even for those that do 100, that score 100, and congratulations to Mathematica for joining us on this journey. All companies would recognize that this is not a reflection of perfection, right? It's not saying that the company has it all figured out. These are big companies. What it is saying is that these companies are engaged in some best practices and that they're actively identifying opportunities to do better, that they're on the journey. And so on that journey and through the DEI, we learn things. We learn a lot of data. In fact, if you go to disabilityequalityindex.org, you can download the 2020 report and you can learn. You can learn about some of the findings that we found in this year's survey. I'll tell you that I think it's really important that this year we grew from 180 companies that participated in 2019 to almost 250. And we had more than half of the Fortune 100. So I think that there's movement here. There's movement in corporate America. Are we there yet? No. Are we scratching the surface? Yeah. We have a long ways to go, though. What we learned from those companies is that I think an important finding was we saw this year that in terms of, on average, the number of employees that identify as being a person with a disability in the workforce of these participating companies rose from 3.9% up to 5.5%. And perhaps that's a reflection that these companies are working on leadership and culture. You asked about some of the best practices. I'm just going to call out two. There are many, and there's also lots of room for improvement. Two things I'd call out is that those that are doing well, 89% of them actually have external efforts in place to recruit talent with disabilities. And maybe even more importantly, 94% of them not only have a written accommodation policy, because everybody should have that, right? But they make it available to their employees in multiple ways so that employees know how to find information on how to request an accommodation.
I wish I'd looked at your report. I didn't realize that it was out currently. Oops, I'm getting a feedback. Oh, it's probably because, yeah. All right, well, I'll ask you a quick question and then put myself on mute. So you mentioned external efforts in place to recruit people with disabilities. So could you elaborate a little more on that practice? I'm not sure what that means exactly. Am I the only one getting the echo, or is everyone getting it?
Maybe it's because mine isn't on mute because you were asking the question.
Yeah, sorry. That's why. Okay, I'll shut up now.
So, I think in terms of external practices that companies have in place, it looks very different, right? And there's multiple ways to go about it. So it may be that that they're utilizing consciously the relationships that they have. For example, if they're showing up on college campuses to recruit talent, they are consciously working to include disability in their recruitment efforts. Like, that's just like an obvious, right? So if I'm working with the HBCUs to recruit talent, am I also looking for talent that includes students with disabilities? So that's one example. I think working specifically to develop relationships with different nonprofits and different government programs, and being very conscious in their efforts to call that out and to talk about what they're doing, to put their stories out there in the public domain. A great example of that is Microsoft. I mean, I think that they're a company that as they're on the journey, I mean, they're certainly not saying like we have it all figured out, but they're saying we are really committed to this, and they're talking about it. And so externally, you see them, whether it's on social media, in the form of Super Bowl ads, in the form of media in terms of the press, hearing their CEO be very public in his recent book, Hit Refresh, talk about when they're talking about empowering all, that's inclusive of people with disabilities, and talking about his personal connection to his child and his children with disabilities. So, you know, it comes, I think their external commitment to recruiting comes in a lot of different forms, but it helps companies to be successful in terms of attracting this talent. So, for example, while we've been sitting here on this event, I was like so excited because at Disability In, we have a program called Next Gen Leaders, where we start with our corporate partners and identify companies that want to mentor college students and recent graduates with disabilities. And then we go out and identify a class every year. So this year in 2020, we have a class of 200 Next Gen students with disabilities from 110 different colleges and universities. They're 59% people of color, 47% women, 20% LGBTQ, 60% STEM. And so it's like a beautiful rainbow of talent. And a great story, a young woman who's part of that class just sent an email and said, hey, great news. I had the internship at Microsoft. Today is my last day of my internship, and I got a job offer. And I start when I graduate, I'm going to be joining the team at Microsoft. So, you know, what a great story to tell in terms of external recruitment.
All right. Well, thank you, Jill. Oh, I'm going to tell you to put yourself on mute so nobody has to hear me twice. Thanks. So we've talked a bit about employment, but when people with disabilities are unable to work or unable to find a job, they often resort to the federal disability programs for financial and healthcare assistance. And so turning to Jason now, as you know, Jason, the structure of the Social Security Disability Insurance Program in particular has been criticized for having an outdated view of disability and creating significant disincentives for individuals to return to work once they enter the program. Your recent work has considered these and other issues and proposed different types of reforms designed to improve the employment outcomes of people who experience disability onset and reduce their reliance on SSDI. So I'm going to ask you if you can talk about the reasons why you think aspects of the SSDI program need reform and some ideas you have for these reforms that will promote employment. And you've got some slides for us, so please cue them up.
Great. Thanks, Gina, and thanks to Mathematica for having me here. I appreciate the time. I also realize we want to make sure we have time for Q&A, so I'll make sure to keep my comments brief. And part of the reason for having PowerPoint slides is it keeps me on track and not going and rambling on too much longer. One of the things, first of all, is the disclaimer. You know, the views I express here, of course, are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of any employer, past, present, or future. anyone living or dead, past, present, or future. They are just my views. But this work is based off co-authored research with Jason Seligman, and Jennifer alluded to earlier, it was part of the SSDI Solutions Initiative, the McCurry-Pomeroy initiative that was for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And what sort of motivated us for this research was looking at the Social Security Disability Insurance Program. And to us, it seemed like it was an all or nothing proposition. And for those of you familiar with the program, you realize that there is something called a substantial gainful allowance. People on disability can work up to, I think in 2020, it's $1,260 a month. And they don't go over, they don't lose their benefits. But a lot of people who do try to work up to that amount park under it. It's called parking. And they're afraid of going over for fear of losing their benefits. And so most people don't even try. And it just seems that the program itself is not designed to be a work retention program. It's not designed to get people back to work. It is a social disability insurance program, which specifically says it's for those who cannot work or are expecting to die within the next 12 months. It's never designed for anything else. And that is a very bifurcated and I think outdated view of disability, which disability now is much more dynamic. It's much more fluid. People can work, and it shouldn't be all or nothing proposition. So our theme here is going beyond all or nothing and trying to reform SSDI to encourage work and wealth. And the proposals we have deal with a few things. So we're going to give you just in a nutshell, and we can save some more for the Q&A. But one of the things we want to do is create a temporary disability award process. So right now, if you get on disability, you get it all, and you're not supposed to work or get up to the SGA, but there's no allowance for part-time work. There's nothing that says, hey, I'm Jason, I'm turning 50, and my back hurts. I can't work 40 hours a week. I could probably work 10, 15, maybe 20. Maybe there's some weeks I could work more, work less. If you tell me I have to go SSDI and it's all or nothing, I'll take all and I'll work nothing. Why don't you allow me to do something partial? Maybe allow me to work half-time and get half disability benefits. Something that encourages the ability to let people work while getting DI without saying all or nothing. And if my condition improves, I'm attached to the labor force, I can go back in. The other thing, and think about temporary disability, is think about pregnancies. Pregnancies do not count for disability insurance, but you could do a temporary award under temporary policy that says we're going to give a 9, 12-month policy for disability for those who are pregnant or have hardship pregnancies. It doesn't have to be a permanent policy, it's now temporary. So we could do temporary or partial or do both. And this is the thing we want to sort of talk about a little bit more further. Again, the idea that disability is more fluid. We could do partial awards. Again, I could work part-time and get partial disability and have it be more fluid. We could create a temporary award if I have some sort of condition that may allow me to go back to work in the future. Maybe it's something with musculoskeletal, maybe it's mental. I can get some conditions that help me with medication. But the idea is to keep some sort of temporary award that's not permanent, some sort of partial award that's not all or nothing, that we can basically allow people to have benefits and not have them detach themselves from the workforce completely. We also want to engage employers. And I think this is an important point too, because depending on who you ask, some employers are doing well with people with disabilities and some are doing a very poor job, whether it's recruitment or retaining them or making accommodations so they can stay in the workforce. We want to make sure we engage employers. And to do this, we would use pilots to test effectiveness. Obviously, this is a very large national program with a lot of people it impacts. We would not just make wholesale changes to SSDI without having some sort of basis and evidence to do so. So we would want to do pilots to test the effectiveness of various designs. These reforms would, again, recognize that disability is not an all or nothing condition. It would support the return to work for those who are on DI now. It would also help to maintain labor force attachment. And as many of you know, once someone leaves the labor force, it's very hard to get back on. For those with on disability, depending on the statistics you use, it's either less than 2% go back or less than 5%, but it's not a very good success rate. When looking at those who are not disabled, but just on the unemployment insurance system, the longer someone maintains on UI, the harder it is for them to get a job. So again, the detachment's very discouraging for reemployment. We want to make sure we do something that maintains labor force attachment. So again, in a nutshell, this is how we would do it. Two fronts, some ideas. One is doing it on individuals, the other is on employers. So with individuals, we would launch pilots offering, again, partial disability payments. They would target both new and existing SSDI beneficiaries who attempt work. This would be voluntary participation for demonstration. We wouldn't force anybody. I want to pause here for a minute about the voluntary nature of this, because from some PhD economists and PhD social scientists, they came back at me and said, Jason, if you do something that's voluntary, you can't do a randomized controlled trial. That's going to make it very hard to do generalizations of the population. And I want to pause. You can do randomized controlled trials within a voluntary population, but the reason we did voluntary is because we don't want to force somebody who may not be able to work to try to work, and that would cause more harm than good. So we're trying to make sure these are humane pilots that test effectiveness without forcing somebody to do something we know they can't do. And a randomized controlled trial that would not have voluntary participation could cause more harm than good, so we want to make sure it's voluntary. We would do something like guarantee a 50% monthly benefit for this trial. And again, sometimes we look at the disability system for Veterans Affairs. They go in 10% increments, 10% disability, 20%, et cetera. We didn't want to get into a point where you're arguing, am I 30% disabled or 40% disabled, 60 or 70? So we figured a 50% cutoff is a good place to start for some sort of partial disability payment. We would also provide benefit counseling as well, health ed or career orientations that would be included in the demonstrations, because healthcare, of course, is very important, as some of the previous panelists have said. That's sort of how we would do the individual side. We would also, though, want to engage employers, and I think employers have a large role to play in this. The general idea is to give a proper incentive for employers to take more responsibility for employee coverage. These pilots can be separate. We can do individual separate, we can do the corporate separate, we can do them together. But the idea is we're sort of thinking about the idea of multiple pilots here. And the reason we want to engage employers is that we've heard enough evidence that seems that for some employers, they don't have an incentive to try to give accommodations to their employees. It's easier just to let them go or let them go on an SSDI and not try to accommodate them. So we want to make sure there's some incentives. Again, we would do pilots and demonstrations. We would do voluntary demonstrations, again, to make sure we get employers first who want to help. Part of the idea is to give a tax credit against the premiums for private disability insurance coverage. One of the things we'd want to do with this reform idea for employers is provide basically private disability insurance for the first 2 years of disability. And the idea here is to change sort of the nature of the insurance program. Again, SSDI is a insurance program. It's a social insurance program. But we want to change sort of the insurance perspective so that the employers are now engaged and concerned with short-term disability, and the public SSDI program is now the long-term disability program. And so for employers now who participate in some sort of idea of a pilot like this, we would give them a tax credit against the premiums for private DI, but they would be responsible for their employees for the first 2 years of coverage of disability. That would allow them to engage with their employees to try to have them some sort of attachment to the workforce, get them back to work. During this 2 years, they could not get public SSDI, but they would be integrated into the system so that their continuing disability reviews and evaluations would be included in the application for SSDI, so that if 2 years were to happen under private disability and they were not able to go back to work, they would seamlessly be handed off to the public SSDI program. So again, the idea is to encourage the employers to have some skin in the game, make sure people are covered, maintain attachment to the workforce, and then again, if they cannot work full time, or maybe in some ways even partially, they have to go on the public disability system, they would do so after 2 years. But this one aligns the incentives with employers. It also puts a limit in some ways on the cost. An employer doesn't have to worry about trying to fund an insurance program that could last 15, 20 years for an employee. They know they're limited to 2, and that makes create the incentives for them to encourage this participation and workforce attachment. That's kind of the general idea with our program. So I'll leave my stuff open to questions for anyone else that has them, and I want to make sure we have time for overall Q&A. I know Gina has a bunch. But again, the idea is to change the incentives both for employees and for employers, and to make sure we encourage work, because there's a lot of dignity that comes to work. When you ask people whether they want to work, if they can work, they do want to. We've seen evidence that there is just a good number of people who would like to do some work, but the program basically gives them a disincentive to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I really want to, well, I want to go to the Q&A for the audience really quickly, but one quick question, and I really want to pull on that pregnancy thread that you lobbed out there, but I'm not going to because I'll get in trouble. I'm sure I'll say something inappropriate. So instead, I'm going to ask you about your idea for the partial benefits. And you talked about voluntary pilot for this kind of thing. I'm having trouble figuring out what would make that attractive to anyone if the front end of the disability process still looks the same, if it's, if they come in the door the same way. Is there a different way they'd come in the door for that kind of a pilot where you'd get to them and it might be attractive instead of, oh, I'm just getting less,
For the partial?
Yes.
Yeah, so the idea of the partial is you wouldn't basically have an exclusion now in some of the income tests. So somebody who basically now, and again, the example I use is someone who might have back pain, because musculoskeletal is taking a lot now of the applications. If somebody has back pain, they no longer can work 40 hours a week. They might want to go on DI and say, I just can't work at all. What if we allowed them some sort of ability to do a partial? So again, whether it's 20 hours a week, let's just do it half. You get half SSDI benefits, you can maintain half of your employment. The application process wouldn't have to go through the whole laborers thing about qualifications to make sure that you were permanently disabled and couldn't work. The threshold would be a lot lower, but you'd have continued disability reviews, evaluations, and now you'd be tested more to make sure that whether you're getting worse or getting better, we would be able to see additionally, and we would allow you to continue work, which is something we don't do now under the current system. So the application process would be smoother and hopefully quicker.
All right, thank you. So let's take some questions from the audience now. My colleague Jody Schimmel-Hyde is going to help me with this because I'm not capable of doing two things at once. So as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A widget at the bottom of the screen, but I've probably taken up too much of the time anyway. But Jody, what have you got? You got any questions?
Yep, we sure do. We actually, as many of you are aware, had the opportunity for people when registering to submit questions ahead of the forum. We got a lot of questions that way, and a bunch of them were similar, so we're going to try to focus on the ones we got that were kind of across a common theme. I think maybe the first one to start would be, we actually got some during the forum about this too, is around mental illness. A lot of the ADA was centered on removing physical barriers to access, yet we know many individuals with disabilities have severe mental illness. Can any of you talk about how the ADA may have been sufficient for addressing mental health barriers, and in what way is the ADA sort of lagging behind what's sufficiently needed to address those barriers, or what research or policy is still needed to support that population? I don't know, Jennifer, Jill, maybe you two could take a crack at that to start.
I'll jump in first, and certainly others have expertise too to lend to this. So I think when the ADA was passed, I think it was interpreted by many as providing physical access to people with disabilities. And there were a lot of questions about whether mental illness or intellectual disabilities were included. That was clarified in 1997. And then in 2008, the ADA Amendments Act further clarified that that mental health disabilities were included, and many of the examples given were mental health disabilities, so that there would be no question that people with bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety were included. At the same time, we see a lot of we see people with mental illness and mental health disabilities falling through the cracks often. And some of it has to do with attitudes and self-identification, not being in systems already, like not knowing how to reach out for the services that they are eligible for. One of the things that we do in our Employment First work is we are now focusing on people with mental health disabilities and making sure that that states know how to use their funding for people to support employment for people with mental health disabilities, because there was even a question of whether Medicaid can support employment for people with mental health disabilities, and of course it can. So explaining how to do that and making sure that an individual has those services available to them in a way that supports their employment, whether it is long-term, daily, or it needs to be, as Jason said, in something that is more flexible. The other thing, and I think Jill can, of course, talk about this too, is that a lot of employer-based mental health supports are becoming much more prevalent and visible now. We've seen so many employers jump in to this discussion and understand that workers, about a quarter of workers are going to experience some kind of mental health trauma while they're working. And my goodness, look at the current condition. A lot of workers are experiencing anxiety or depression related to COVID and their employment situation. So having those supports available in the workplace, whether it's virtual or not, are important. We did publish something called a mental health toolkit that on our Employer Technical Assistance Center website. That's askearn.org, and it has 4 categories of strategies to support workers with mental health conditions, or workers that are experiencing anxiety and depression or other conditions right now. And I would encourage people to check it out, because there are practical strategies that employers are using, and we use examples of employers and how they have implemented those strategies in the workplace. And I don't think it will be a surprise to Jill. They are all disability in employers. So we're happy to note that as well. Thank you.
So this is Jill, and I would just to piggyback on what Jennifer just said. You know, from the employer standpoint, and during COVID, I think, you know, what we're seeing is that in fact, there's Accenture research that says that 9 out of 10 of us are touched by mental health. And so what we're encouraging at Disability In is that companies lead with humanity, not just during these times, but in general. I think that these times have created an opportunity for employers to show empathy, to be available for their employees, to check in with people, to see how they're doing, to explore the mental health benefits, and to look at expanding what's available, to making sure that employees have access to care and that they're able to talk about what they're feeling. I think that the last thing that I would call out is that the greatest resource that employers have are their people. And in the large companies that we work with at Disability In, they have employee resource groups. And so we're really encouraging business, if they have an employee resource group, to go and engage with their disability employee resource group on these topics, and create that forum, share resources, and really act as advocates for each other. Lastly, I'd say at Disability In, if you go to disabilityin.org, to our website, and click on resources, we also have a mental health toolkit there where we've mined best practices. So that's out there in the public domain for folks to check out.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Jody? Any
Before we let you off the hook and you unmute yourself, we had a couple of questions come in during the forum. If you could talk a bit about the employers that typically complete the DEI. We had questions whether you engage with nonprofits, whether you work with state agencies. If you do or don't, is that just a matter of who selects into it? Is there information that would be relevant for that type of group? Just a bit more about who Disability In works with.
So one thing is that we work with everybody. But Disability In is really that place where business comes together to learn from each other, and predominantly large businesses. So the Disability In is a tool that was, our Disability Equality Index is a tool that was created for the Fortune 1000 and for the AmLaw 200. So it was created for those size of companies. It lives in the public domain. So if you go to disabilityequalityindex.org, you can actually download the survey. All of the questions are out there. And I would share that, you know, there are companies out there, there are state agencies out there that may not be eligible to participate in the survey itself, but they've downloaded the survey and they've modified it and they've used it to help them. In terms of how do we engage with states and with nonprofits, every company out there needs partners, and they need partners locally. So I think one of the keys to success for employers when they're on this journey is to find good partners. And so it's partnering with local nonprofits, and it's partnering with state agencies, and it's partnering with federal programs like Jennifer called out, like the Job Accommodation Network or the EARN Center. You know, these are great resources out there, and these companies need every resource that they can get their hands on to find the talent and to get the help that they need to get the job done. The last thing that I'd call out is that we have affiliates at the local level, and many of our affiliates are comprised of local state organizations and nonprofits. So many ways to get involved in advancing disability inclusion at Disability In.
All right, we have one question turning directions a little bit. Jason, this is for you. We've had a few questions coming in about your proposal, sort of in light of other proposed reforms to the DI program. If you could possibly talk in a minute or two about, are there any big picture themes that emerge from those different policy proposals? And some disability advocates seem to be opposed to this type of change, concerned that program reforms will effectively cut benefits and undermine the social safety net. To the extent you can, is there a way to take those common themes and unite advocates and policymakers to achieve some sort of consensus proposal going forward?
Well, I would hope so, Jody. I mean, one of the issues that we have in this is, I think we should bring in, this is not trying to be a trust fund solvency measure. We're very clear in the research paper that some of these programs like partial and temporary disability could have what's called an inducement effect, which actually could encourage more people to apply for DI and beyond DI. So you could have more people on the rolls. But you might also have program savings if you have less benefits going out, but even more on the rolls because people are staying attached to the workforce. And I think the issue here, and there was another question, I was looking at the chat, I think it was Alan Bergman mentioned it, where you seem not to be taking on a discussion about how to change the legislative language about what is a disability. It's very, very strict. It's very, very hard to get an SSDI. And there's a concern that if we open up the definition to be more broad, to be more dynamic, that will have more people on the program. That would actually help people. So the advocate should be, in some ways, in my corner and saying, let's talk about how we can encourage more people who need this program to be on it, while also realizing there are some limitations that we don't want people on the program forever who don't need to be on the program. How do we encourage work and workforce attachment? So we're not trying to kick anybody off SSDI. We're trying to make sure there's some sort of program for those who want to work to be able to work, especially those who can work some hours, but right now the program is designed in a way that discourages them. And this is something where Gina didn't want to go into it, but I'll bring it back up because we did mention the idea of maternity. I'm not saying people who are pregnant are disabled, but I do want to recognize that there are some people who their pregnancies make it difficult to work. And some who are lower wage workers or hourly workers don't have access to paid leave programs. If they had a temporary disability program that allowed for a partial or a temporary maternity program, that could be a short-term way to have some sort of coverage. And again, think about a social insurance program. And a social insurance program is something that basically says there's a high cost but a low probability of something lasting longer. And for a maternity issue, for those who basically couldn't work during a short period of time, this could be a great bridge and a great help for them. So it's more thinking holistically about what disability means, thinking about it more dynamically and realizing that the legislative barriers we have in some ways are those on some side who think that if we make it too broad, everyone will claim some sort of disability and want to be on the program. Well, if we encourage work too much, you'll have people who say, I can't work and won't get any benefits at all. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it holistic and be more centered on the idea that there are people who cannot work and then they should be on DI, and that's fine. There are those who can work a partial disability, and those we want to encourage them to do so and keep them attached to the labor force. So it really is trying to bring people together and find where that sweet spot is.
All right, we got to lob one question to John.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There was some confusion over what time this forum would end, 3:45 or 4. We had intended 3:45, but if we have one more question we could put out there, we could go a little over.
I think it's a good.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is actually a good place to end. It's sort of looking toward the future.
Okay.
I think any conversation these days would be remiss without mentioning that the pandemic is leading to many historic changes. High rates of unemployment, the shuttering of nonprofits, community providers, concerns about safe work environments, increased telework arrangements, and potentially an increase of employer willingness to make accommodations. This kind of relates to where we've been and where we're headed. John, would you be willing to answer what your sense is of how policy for supporting individuals with disabilities may change in coming months and how that may signal, potential for improvement going forward?
That's a big question, Jody.
Yep. Thought we'd end with you with that one.
Looking big picture, I think we need to be careful. I would say I'm guardedly optimistic about where we could be going. I think COVID has taught all of us that we can work differently because we've had to work differently. If we look at, I talked a lot about the Medicaid program. There's been a lot of flexibilities granted in that program. Reimbursement where we've never seen reimbursement before, for people with disabilities to get direct care professionals who they have hired to come to the hospital during a short-term hospitalization and do what they need and get paid for Medicaid to do that. The expansion of telemedicine and telehealth services, for example, delivering services in a very different way, paying for it in many more cases than we ever have. And I think that flexibility is great. It'll aid rural areas. That's all fantastic. But we also need to recognize that there are things that we can't do in a virtual environment and shouldn't do in a virtual environment. And to go back to where we started with the ADA, and it's about inclusion and integration of people with disabilities, we don't want to be creating a two-tiered system, going back to a two-tiered system where we have different gradations or services for employment, for example. We want to make sure that people with disabilities remain integrated. We don't want to assume that they should all be remote. I mean, this has been a conversation we've been having for a long time. So mindful of the integration, let's look at what's working. Let's look at what I would call emerging best practices. In a conversation with the Administration for Community Living earlier this week, they're looking at the employment system, and they're asking our network, what are you doing? How are you adapting? How are you continuing to deliver services, in some cases, in a positive way, in a home environment where people needed to go to a community-based setting before? Obviously, that's not going to happen now. But more targeting of services, more customization of services, is that possible? And we're always going to be asked about fraud and abuse, and wherever there's a level of consumer and control, especially we're being asked questions about fraud and abuse. But where are we seeing things begin to take hold, begin to work that will contribute to system redesigns? Which flexibilities are we seeing either in reimbursement or in regulation that aren't compromising the health and safety of people, obviously, but are allowing us to deliver services and be creative in a different way? So that's certainly a conversation that's happening among the disability community. We know that's a conversation that started at the federal government level. I hope that it's happening at the state level and at the state provider level too, but capitalizing on flexibilities, again, data and research, what's working, how do we know that it's working, so that we can begin to escalate and elevate some of these pockets of innovation that are now happening as a result of COVID but could benefit a broader population.
All right. Thank you, John. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers and the audience for participating in the discussion today. I thought it was interesting. I hope you can join us for our next webinar, which is on September 24th. We're going to discuss expanding integrated employment for people with disabilities and lessons learned from the Pathways to Careers program. So stay well, everyone, and thank you for joining us.